Welcome to History 111, Lecture 10, The French and Indian War. During this time period, a policy called salutary neglect emerges, and what that basically comes down to is this. The British paid very little attention to what was going on in the colonies. The day-to-day administration of colonial affairs was decentralized and inefficient. Few British officials ever visited America. What information they got came in large part from agents sent to England by the colonial assemblies to lobby for some particular American interest, and those agents did nothing to encourage interference with colonial affairs. And over time, while less an unofficial policy, people start to rationalize it as being something that's good for the colonies. It's for their health. It will make them better and stronger if England simply leaves them alone. Now, that said, there are some conflicts between royal governors and colonists that happened during this time period. There are two controversies worth knowing about. One is the Pistola Fee controversy, and the other is the Gadsden election controversy. What happens with the first one is the governor of Virginia proclaims a tax for the use of his seal on all land patents. On the other hand, the House of Burgess, which is the colonial body that exists there, declares that it alone had the right to tax people of Virginia. The dispute is ultimately settled in 1754 when the London government decided in the governor's favor, but reduced that tax down to the point where it was basically insignificant and irrelevant. Now, with the Gadsden election controversy, what we have there is the governor, Thomas Boone, is going to refuse to administer the oath of office to a man named Christopher Gadsden, who had been elected to the colonial assembly. And the South Carolina assembly seated him anyway. And in response to that defiance, the governor declared the assembly exists at the pleasure of the crown, and it was not a basic right of colonists to participate in government. The assembly becomes outraged and refuses to do any business with the governor, and the conflict also went to London to be settled. Now, while the British government is going to criticize the Assembly's favor, it is not going to back the governor at this stage. So by and large, with these two exceptions, pretty much the British don't interfere. It's only when we have an issue that they can't settle within the colony that London takes any action. Here we have a map of North America in 1754, and what you can see is there's a large swatch of green territory that belongs to England, and you can also see the kind of yellowish beige territory that belongs to France. And what you can see is that exists right between two major chunks of British territory, and you can see the hash pattern where it's indicating large amounts of disputed land. And that's going to become something of an issue at that time period. By about 1700, the English and the French are going to be competing directly for dominance over North America, and both sides are going to become increasingly dependent on Native American allies. The English in particular are alarmed by the expansion of French influence into the Ohio Valley and increased French influence in the Appalachians. As a result of all this, three small wars are going to be fought in North America between the two sides: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and Queen George's War. The 1748 treaty that ended King George's War also laid the seeds for the French and Indian War because it didn't settle who controlled the Ohio Valley. Now, shortly thereafter, the French are going to begin building a chain of forts from the St. Lawrence River to the Mississippi, and in doing so, they're going to build Fort Duquesne on land that's claimed by Virginia, and Virginia is going to send a small force under a young man at the time named George Washington, and the incident at Fort Duquesne is going to spark a larger war, and for the first 2 years, it's only fought by the colonists, and after 2 years, it expands to become a global war with England and France entering into it in direct conflict with each other and both sending troops to North America. Now, do realize, even though in American history it's called the French and Indian War, which is the people whom it was fought against, in European terms it's called the 7 Years' War. Even though the war lasted 9 years, the European terminology for it reflects only the point from which the French and the English became directly involved. So you'll sometimes see it that way and should be familiar with it. Early on in the war, the Albany Congress is summoned as an intercolonial conference that has delegates from the colonies, Britain, and the Iroquois, and it's called by the English Board of Trade to deal with a variety of issues at the time, one of which being the grievances of the Iroquois against the colonists, and also the presence of hostile French forces in the West. The Albany Plan for Union is proposed by Benjamin Franklin, who is going to suggest a colonial assembly to manage defense and Indian affairs, pass laws, raise taxes, and so on. The chief executive of the assembly was to be a president general appointed by the King of England, but the plan fails, but it's the first real attempt by the colonists to unite due to the distance and indifference of an English government, and really what's motivating at the time is this growing conflict with the French in the West. And had it not been for that factor, it might not have had as much urgency, this issue. Although the colonists did make some attempts to work together and unite, the war in America really goes very well for the French at the beginning. They had better Indian allies, more professional troops. But starting in 1758, the British begin to commit more and more troops in the North American front, and this begins to turn the tide. And Quebec, which is really the capital of the French territory, is captured in 1759. And in 1762, are going so badly that France gives New Orleans and its territory west of Mississippi to Spain in order to keep it out of British hands. And in 1763, France and Britain sign a peace treaty, and that's going to hand over a lot of the other territories that France has. There are big consequences to the war. This is going to expand England's territorial claims to America at the same time as it massively expands Britain's debt. It's going to generate resentment towards the Americas among the English leaders, and it's going to persuade English leaders that a major reorganization of the empire is going to be necessary because these colonists, acting on their own, started a major global war. At least that's the English view. It's also going to mean that colonists are going to be forced to act together against common foes, and the colonists are going to begin to resent increased British presence after the war. For the Indians of the Ohio Valley, who had sided with the French, this was disastrous. The Iroquois Confederacy, which allied with Britain, only fared slightly better, however. Now, let's take a look at what this really does in terms of territory. If we look at this map here, you can see the British colonies, the dispute area, and France very easily. And here in a second, we'll see what happens after the war, and you should notice big changes. Now keep in mind, the color scheme on this map is exactly the same, so it's going to take some effort to find what's left. You see a little bit of French territory up way at the top near Canada, and you see a little bit down with where Haiti is now. And you can also see the major change with regards to French Louisiana going to Spain. What you see is basically France is gone from North America, and now it's really about the British and the Spanish. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, the colonists began working together, and you definitely need to know about the Albany Plan for Union. In addition, France is going to lose a lot of territory, but at the same time, Britain is going to end up with a massive debt, and all of these things are going to have huge consequences in the next time period. See you in the next lecture.